Hello, curious minds. Welcome back to another exciting phase of our journey, and probably the most exciting one, where we are going into the world of AWS SageMaker. And look how easily we have seen the AI world from top to bottom. We started like a novice at our 100,000 feet view, where at that stage we knew absolutely nothing about data science, machine learning, or AI. We quickly dived to 50k feet view and gathered the knowledge of bare minimum foundational topics to get us started. With that, we set up our own hands-on garage at the 30,000 feet view by installing Python in our local, and we also set up our free tier account in AWS. And then we become a real developer at our 10,000 feet view, where we not only coded a machine learning program, but we actually built a graphical user interface as well. And now we are here to become a complete professional at our 1000 feet view by putting our knowledge and seeing what exactly is AWS SageMaker and why do we really need it. Enough of recap. We are in a real rush to see the SageMaker at first hand. So let's head straight into our garage and see what AWS SageMaker is. Okay, let's go to the AWS Management Console, which we created in our last session. In the browser, let's type in AWS Management Console, click the first link, and then sign into the console. Now, since we have just completed our AWS sign up, we haven't created different type of user identities which we can in AWS. So in a particular account, we can have a developer account, a tester account, and so on and so forth. And that setting up of account and privileges is done using something called as IAM. I think most people who are familiar with cloud would know. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So with this, we can log into the account with different type of privileges. But since we haven't set up any different account yet, so what we are going to do is we will sign in with the root user email. This is the same email that we used at the time of signing it up. Let me type in my user email and password. Okay. In the management console, you will type in SageMaker and then SageMaker, and then you will see Amazon SageMaker AI. Now please remember that this type of menu keep on changing in AWS. They keep on updating the service name on a very frequent basis. So the video that you are seeing now, by the time you do it, it might have a little different name, but I think SageMaker is their unique service name that is going to continue. Earlier, it used to be called just Amazon SageMaker. Now they have Amazon SageMaker AI, and that's the small name change that they have done. Okay, now once we have found the SageMaker service, and since we are new to the AWS setup, it says that new to SageMaker, quick setup for a single user. That's all we need. And if we click on this information icon, it says that when we set up the new user, it is going to set up a new IAM role with AWS SageMaker full access policy, right? So this is the very same thing that we were discussing a while ago, that we have to set up different type of users. Now with this quick setup, AWS will be able to set up a user for us. It is also going to provide public internet access and standard encryption, which means that the notebook that we are going to create within SageMaker will be accessible from our public internet as well. And of course, if we want those notebook to be restricted, then there are enough settings which can make your notebook private as well. The next thing that it is going to set up is a SageMaker Studio for us as a beginner. It is our JupyterLab version. It is very much same as the Jupyter that we installed in our local using Anaconda. And then it is going to create shareable SageMaker Studio notebooks, some authentication and canvas, right? So it is setting up basic things that allow us to create notebook in a SageMaker environment. So let's set up a new user. Okay, let's give a minute to understand the different things that is shown on the screen. Again, when we are setting up the SageMaker, we want to understand some important details so that we know what AWS is doing behind the scenes for enabling JupyterLab for us. Okay, let's have a look. It says general settings, some name is here. This domain ID is very important. We will talk about this. This actually gives us access to the different type of notebooks that we are going to create. Then the next important thing that we see here is the authentication and permission. The default execution role is AWS SageMaker execution role. So there are different type of roles that are assigned, that can be assigned for a particular user. Now since this is a quick setup, so what AWS has done on our behalf is it has created a user and it has correctly assigned it the execution role with the assumption that the person who is going to use the SageMaker is of course going to execute SageMaker service, execute notebook as well. So the simpler name for that role is Amazon SageMaker execution role. Then there is setting about the network. We are not network expert, but from here people who want to restrict their notebooks in one or the other way can do it, but for us we are going to keep everything as default. Storage confirmation. So it says that the auto mount home EFS is set to domain by default, right? So what is storage and what is EFS? EFS is elastic file storage. In a very simple term, you have been given some disk space on the AWS where you can store your notebook. Okay. This EBS elastic block storage, what it has given us is a default private size of 5 GB. So we have a small tiny laptop of 5 GB space. We can increase it to 100 and the shared space is also 5. So as you can see that AWS is setting up a tiny machine for us where we are able to run the Jupyter notebook. And then there are more settings, but importantly we do not want to change any of this setting and all we have to do is say submit. Okay, and with this let's go back to SageMaker AI again at the top, or you can search in the search bar as well. Click on the studio and from studio you can see that a default user profile has been created. This is the user that we have just configured with the default configuration. Let's click studio. And we want to click accept. We don't want a quick tour, instead we will have a quick tour on our own. So we'll just say skip tour for now. And in this SageMaker Studio, you can see that there are variety of applications that has been provided to us, and then there are variety of options as well. Let's talk about some important options which are needed at this time. The first application that we are going to use extensively is a JupyterLab. A JupyterLab is very similar to the Jupyter that we installed through Anaconda in our previous sessions. The only difference is when we installed Anaconda in our local and when we are executing Jupyter in our local, then everything was in local which means that the overall cost that we are going to pay is the cost of electricity, is the cost of power that our laptop or our machine is using. When we talk about JupyterLab, machine is configured by AWS for us to use, but AWS is going to charge for that machine depending on our usage. The name of that machine in AWS term is called as EC2. The full form of that is Elastic Cloud Compute. Now let's not again get overwhelmed by the jargon. In simpler terms, it is just a virtual machine which is set up by AWS for our usage. Every time we use the machine, every time we run the notebook, there will be a cost that will be associated to it, which essentially means that whenever we are done with our work, we want to switch off that machine. How we will be switching off that machine is what we will be covering as well, right? But important thing is there is a remote machine which AWS has provided us, and we have to make sure that that remote machine should be switched off after our use, else we will incur the cost. And since our account is a free tier account at this time, so we are not going to pay anything. When we are out of free quota, then all of these concepts will matter, right? So it's good to have the best practice when the free account is running, so that when we transfer ourselves from free account to paid account, then we never incur any unwanted cost. Okay, so JupyterLab we saw. Then AWS also provide R Studio. As we have discussed, R is another popular language for machine learning in AI. We will be focusing more on Python. So R Studio we are not going to use. Canvas is again another application which is provided by AWS, where we can design data science and machine learning programs. Our focus at this time is keeping things simple, which means that we will be completely focusing on JupyterLab only. However, the two important application that we would be seeing in future is the code editor. This code editor is a service where you can run the code in an AWS environment like your local. But let's not overwhelm ourselves with this at this time. And the next service that we will be using is the ML flow. But all of these service we will be looking when we are comfortable with the most basic service of SageMaker Studio, which is the JupyterLab. Okay, now let's do a quick walk down. There is a home. Now there is something called as running instances. Running instances means that whatever machines on which our notebook is running will be shown here. This is an important concept. Now what do we see here under running instances? No running instances. So at this time we do not have any instances that is running. And when we start the JupyterLab, that time a machine will be switched on and you will see the running instance here. So this is an important tab which tells that which instances, which machines are running, which are the machine which are incurring cost, right? So this is an important tab. Let's see the next option which is important to us. We are going to skip compute, we are going to skip data, because these are the services which are not at this time of our focus. AutoML is another feature which is provided by AWS, where we can define the requirements in a drag and drop option, and instead of rewriting the whole notebook from top to bottom, AWS will write the notebook behind the scene, and all we will see is a drag and drop feature on the screen. AutoML, it's a very interesting service, but at the same time I believe that when we code something, that time we know the nitty-gritties of the tool and the environment, right? So while AutoML is a very good service, we will not be spending too much time on it. Instead we will be making things on our own, because we want to be fundamentally clear. Then the next important tab is the jobs, right? And we are going to talk a lot about jobs, when we deploy our first notebook, right? What are the different type of jobs and how do they play the role? Now at this time what we want to understand is, when we are going to create a JupyterLab, then that machine can be a small machine which has a limited RAM, which has a limited hard disk as well, right? Let's assume you develop a small notebook which basically reads from a CSV file, and it predicts some value based on some linear regression algorithm, very similar to what we did in our last session. Now, if this is a small notebook and if this is a small data set, then you can run it on your local laptop and it will work perfectly fine. But the real challenge comes when your data size itself is, let's say, 100 GBs of data, right? Your program is still tiny, 2 KB, 5 KB, 10 KB size, right? Let's have a quick look here with our projects. Right, if we go to our linear regression that we did last time, what is the size of our notebook? 159 KB, right? That's all we need to predict a particular value of y based on the value of x that we saw in the last time. In this notebook, the data is not part of it, right? Now when we are going to work in real world, then the data will not be stored in the notebook, but it will be stored as a separate data file, which can be, let's say, 100 GB of size, right? So you have a small notebook 159 KB which has to read 100 GB of data, and then it has to predict the value. Your RAM, local RAM, is not going to do it. In fact, when you create the JupyterLab, the tiny machine that you are going to create may not be able to load 100 GB of data, right? So what AWS has provided, that when you work on a notebook, that time you can have a tiny machine. You create the notebook, you run the proof of concept with a smaller data set and everything is fine. But when it is about training the model, when it is about running the notebook on larger data sets, right? Just because your data is huge, you do not want to procure a huge machine. So what AWS provides us is, you create the notebook on a tiny machine, but when it is about training your data, that time you can configure altogether a different machine with a lot bigger size, with a lot bigger RAM size, which is able to process this 100 GB of data very quickly. Now, what is the advantage of having two machines? One tiny machine where your notebook is running, and one big machine where your training job is running. The training job, it can execute, let's say, for 1 hour on the big machine, right? But when you execute the same job on your tiny machine, then it may take 24 hours or maybe 2 days, 3 days, who knows, right? So you do not want to process this huge data on a tiny machine and wait for 2 days. Instead, you want to procure a bigger machine, get the job done in 1 hour. Whatever is the result is sent back to your tiny machine. So that is the power of jobs, where you can segregate your development machine from training machine. You can also segregate your machines from the development machine to the model evaluation, performance evaluation, whatever it is. So jobs is basically a very important service which allows us to segregate the development machine from the different type of tasks that our program is expected to do. We are going to see all of these options in very detail in the upcoming sessions. All right, the next thing that we are going to see in a quick overview is the pipelines. Now, as the word says, pipeline is a AWS service which allows us to move our development code from development machine to different type of testing machines, UAT machine, and production machine in an automated way, right? So pipeline is a very integrated concept with the DevOps and CI/CD part. With the CI/CD part, where we are able to develop the code and productionize it in an automatic fashion. So we are going to see the concept of pipelines in a very simple to the most advanced way. Then the next tab that we would want to see is models, right? This is where the small model, if you remember from our last session, we created a very simplistic model called as myfittedmodel.pkl using the job library, right? AWS allows us to store our model in a separate repository. That's where this model service will come into picture. So we are going to see this tab also in a lot more detail. The next tab which is of interest for us is the JumpStart tab. Now in JumpStart, as the word says, AWS has provided a lot of models which are like a boilerplate code. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. All we have to do is go to the JumpStart, and then there are a ton of models that AWS has provided for us, and then you will be seeing a lot more popular name here as well, right? Hugging Face is there, Llama model is there from Meta, AI 21 Stable Diffusion is there. There is a lot of boilerplate models which are already available for our ready consumption. So we are going to make use of this jumpstart models as well. The next tab that we want to see is the deployments tab. This is another important service that we are going to use a lot, and the most important part of this service is the endpoints. What is an endpoint, how it works, this is also we are going to see. Now one thing that you can observe from this whole discussion, that AWS in SageMaker has provided us a lot of facilities, a lot of features where we would want to focus on our main use case instead of we focusing on the logistics part, right? We want a machine, AWS will give you. We want a separate training machine, AWS will give you. We want a separate deployment machine, AWS will give you. We want a CI/CD deployment, AWS provides it. We want to make use of existing model, AWS SageMaker provides it. So all of these services are provided in one parent service, and the name of that service is called as SageMaker, right? So when we talk about developing a program in SageMaker, it essentially means that we are going to make use of lot of sub services which are present in SageMaker. That's why it's called a SageMaker Studio. It's a studio with a lot of services which focuses on data science, machine learning, and of course generative AI. I think it's a very good walkthrough of the options that are available to us as a beginner. We are going to deal with all these options in lot more detail as we walk through in our next session, where we will create our first notebook using JupyterLab, and we will see all these options that we discussed today as a real thing. So let's keep adding fun to our learning journey, and I will see you in the next session.